Hello, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you all to this Environment and Society discussion series event, Loss and Damage, Where Are We Now and What Happens Next? My name is Nina Jeffs, and I'm a Schwarzman Academy Fellow at Chatham House's Environment and Society program. This is the first of a two-part event series on loss and damage. Today's event will outline the key debates and discuss what progress has been made on advancing the loss and damage agenda within climate change negotiations. The second event, taking place on the 8th of February, will focus on solutions and possible ways forward, looking ahead to the COP27 negotiations in Egypt later this year. One definition of loss and damage is that it refers to both economic and non-economic harms and destruction caused by climate change impacts that cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation. That being said, there are many different understandings of the concept, which our esteemed speakers will explore further. The science tells us that the impacts of climate change, both slow onset events such as sea level rise and desertification, as well as sudden impact events such as floods and droughts, are already here and they are accelerating. Climate change impacts are disproportionately felt in the parts of the world that have done the least to contribute to global greenhouse gas emissions. And so the issue of loss and damage has never been more pressing. Yet despite having been raised in international climate change negotiations since the early 1990s, the issue remains highly divisive and largely unresolved. Politically, key reasons that loss and damage is highly disputed include its connection with the historical responsibility of developed countries in causing climate change, the issue of liability for loss and damage, as well as associated calls for compensation from developing countries. In the scientific community, discussion remains about how to quantify loss and damage and attribute it to climate change, although the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report represented a great stride forward in this area. And in terms of finance, there is certainly no consensus on where loss and damage finance should come from, how it can be delivered and distributed at a subnational level to reach the people that need it most. Other issues include ensuring that it is additional to other types of climate finance. Loss and damage is expected to be high on the agenda at COP27 later this year, especially as Egypt, the host country, is highly vulnerable to climate change, according to the 2019 NGOs Index. In this context, it's important to understand not just the urgency and the importance of the issue of loss and damage, but also its complexity. And that is our task today. To take this on, we are very fortunate to be joined by three eminent experts on loss and damage from around the world. I'm excited to introduce our fantastic panel for today, each of whom brings a unique and valuable perspective to this multifaceted issue. Dr. Adele Thomas, Senior Caribbean Research Associate from Climate Analytics, Professor Lisa Van Haala, Principal Investigator of Climate Change Loss and Damage and Professor of Political Science, University College London, and Nasreen El-Saim, Chair, UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And we are sharing their impressive bios on the chat box for a more detailed introduction to their background and their expertise. A little bit of quick housekeeping. This event is on the record and it will be recorded and shared online afterwards. We have an hour for this event, and during this time we'll spend about half an hour in an interactive moderated discussion, and then we will open up the conversation for your questions. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function throughout the conversation. And we will invite you to unmute and ask the panel your question directly so that we can hear all of your voices in this discussion. So if you won't be able to unmute and do this, please indicate that when you submit your questions so we know. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your fantastic questions. We will make as much time for them as possible. So to kick off our discussion, first I'd like to hear from you, Adele. To begin our discussion, there are many different understandings of what loss and damage is. And could you please introduce us to some of these different understandings and how they differ?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Nina, you're quite correct in what you say. There is no one agreed upon definition of loss and damage. And I think that complexifies the whole discussion about loss and damage if we can't agree on what we're talking about. So there is a growing set of scientific literature which really explores the different understandings that are out there. And from that literature, we can sort of pull that there are three main categories of understanding what loss and damage is. The first one is that all negative impacts of climate change can be considered as loss and damage. And this is the most broad understanding. So any negative consequence that is a result of climate change can be called loss and damage. Sort of the second main understanding is that loss and damage only happens after limits to adaptation have been reached. So you'll do as much as you can to adapt to climate change, but there's a limit as to how much adaptation can accomplish. And so after you reach an adaptation limit, then the impacts that remain are loss and damage. So for example, you could adapt by putting in a seawall. That seawall could prevent flooding from up to 0.5 meter of sea level rise. But if sea levels rise above 0.5 meter, then you'll get some flooding from that, and then that flooding would be loss and damage. So this understanding of loss and damage only coming after limits to adaptation wouldn't include any negative impacts that occur before adaptation is implemented or that occur before adaptation limits are reached. And then sort of the third major category of understanding loss and damage is that loss and damage are the most critical negative impacts of climate change. So not all negative impacts, but things that are irreversible, such as loss of islands due to sea level rise, loss of important cultural activities, loss of livelihoods. So those most critical and irreversible impacts would be considered to be loss and damage. And so trying to come to a common understanding or a definition of loss and damage in the UNFCCC context has proven to be very difficult, as there are these different understandings that then have different implications for how loss and damage will be addressed. And I think it's really critical to note that these definitions overlap. So the first understanding of all negative impacts being loss and damage also includes that third understanding, which are the irreversible impacts. So you can see the complexities, but I think these categories sort of help to understand people's different perspectives on loss and damage. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that really clear delineation of the different categories, and also the fact that the categories themselves sort of blur into each other in different conversations. And so thank you for laying that out. Nasreen, if I may, I'd like to bring you in here to sort of find out, how do you see these different understandings of loss and damage? And are there any priority sort of areas or key focuses for African countries in terms of understanding this issue?
Yeah, I actually love the fact that you asked me, how do you see, which means that is, for me, it's not a theoretical thesis or just a piece of paper or reports or numbers. It's actually a fact that we are living every day, unfortunately. The African continent is a big mass, and by big mass, we mean that the actual land mass of the African continent is so big. And this have many implications. First of all, we might not be as impacted as many small island states, for example, as many Asian countries, for example, when it comes to the rise of the sea level. But unfortunately, we are very much impacted when it comes to global warming. A report by IGAD Regional Center for Meteorology already announced that more than 7 cities within the African continent have been warmed up even more than 2 degrees Celsius. So for us, for African, especially for the sub-Saharan Africa, the 2 degrees is not something far, it's something we already reached. So let's imagine that we continued business as usual and things as it's happening right now, how much we will actually reach when it comes to the global warming itself. For the Sudanese context, for example, loss and damage is not only in the infrastructure, is not only in the crops and the economic situation, but it's also unfortunately in lives. And by life, I don't mean climate crises, I mean the peace and security threats, because climate change is a major and root cause and a huge drive for conflicts in my country and many countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. So we end up losing a lot of life, not because of they call it natural disasters, but for me, I'm sure it's nothing called nature can never bring disasters. It's always a response of nature on what humans are doing. So it's always climate crisis or climate disasters. In 2020, where the whole world was actually in lockdown because of the COVID, we didn't have this luxury of actually having a lockdown because we had a very devastating flood. It was the worst in 100 years. And it showed very much the differences between the different countries. I have many friends in Europe and UK and US were complaining about quarantine. And I was saying that quarantine is a huge privilege that we didn't have at that time. And I know that many African countries did not have. So the contexts are very different, very variable, and of course, sometimes very devastating to some continents. I will put a link in the chat for a video we made about the flood we had in 2020.
Thank you, that would be fantastic. And I think my colleague Anna will be able to share that with everyone once you put it in the chat. So thanks so much. And thank you, Nazreen, for really sharing some of the lived reality of climate impacts and the fact that it's not just direct impacts of climate change that are relevant, but also the indirect impacts, the social, political, environmental, economic impacts that come about as a result. So thank you for providing that as part of our conversation. When people speak about the issue of loss and damage, they often characterize it in sort of different frames. For example, as an issue of climate justice or as an issue of disaster risk reduction. And these different frames can be seen as one reason for the impasses in debates and negotiations around loss and damage. So Lisa, I'm wondering if you could come in here to talk about where are the gaps in the different framings of the issue of loss and damage, and how have these framings changed over time?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. And just kind of responding to what Adele and Nazreen have said, I think it's really important to differentiate what we mean when we talk about these kind of concrete, embodied, lived experiences of climate change, loss and damage. And we see a growing science of loss. Petra Schackart, for example, has written a wonderful piece called 1,000 Ways to Experience Loss. I think Adele Thomas is one of the leading kind of voices in that growing science, looking at this phenomenon. And what we're talking about, today, what I'm about to talk about, this idea of kind of the frames of loss and damage, is focusing very much on this emerging theme in global governance and kind of the last 15 years of how that has evolved and how that's continuing to evolve and pick up steam. And so what I might do is share my screen here and share a table that is part of a book that I'm working on called Governing the End. And what we talk about when we talk about framing, this is an idea that comes from the sociologist Irving Goffman, and it's basically allows us a kind of schemata of interpretation. It helps us to organize and communicate about reality. And so what we might want to think about when we talk about loss and damage is what is the problem of loss and damage and how is that framed in this global governance space? And what are the potential solutions to that problem? And with these different frames come different kind of implications in terms of ethics, in terms of institutional jurisdiction, in terms of the different roles and responsibilities of actors within this particular space. And so what we've seen, what we've kind of observed in the UNFCCC in discussions about loss and damage is two distinct framings. And we can't very clearly kind of divide this necessarily as like a developed or developing country issue or kind of framings. There have been some overlaps, but there are also patterns and kind of who tends to adopt these frames and with what ends. So the first one of these we might talk about in terms of kind of an uncertainty about climate change, an emphasis on risk, which is about really, not really knowing what's causing what and where certain impacts might happen. And we see certain sets of actors, often developed countries, emphasizing the uncertainty, emphasizing kind of risk rather than talking about harm. The second framing, which you can see at the bottom there on the left, is really focused a lot more on a justice relationship, thinking about responsibility for climate change, historic responsibility, focusing on loss, focusing on harm, and focusing on that relationship of kind of justice and thinking about attribution when we think about the kinds of knowledge that we need. And so from these two different distinct framings, you have flowing from that a different set of kind of signature policy responses. So a different set of kind of roles and responsibilities for developed and developing countries, and a different understanding of the role of global governance institutions. So with that kind of more developed world framing on risk and uncertainty, there's a lot of the policy responses talk about risk management, risk transfer. There's a lot of interest in insurance coming from this camp. There's a lot of talk about building resilience, right? And what that does, that emphasis on risk and resilience building, is it pushes responsibility onto the leaders of developing countries, right? This is about you taking care of your populations at home rather than, us being responsible for this problem and stepping up to the plate in that way. And then it also has certain implications, and historically had, about whether the UNFCCC is even the appropriate venue to deal with these issues, whether it might be better dealt with in the kind of regime on disaster risk reduction, which has implications because the UNFCCC is a kind of more robust legal regime than the UNISDR is. It's also about where loss and damage fits within the work of the UNFCCC, and so it's often been lumped in with kind of adaptation by players that advance this frame. And the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee, which is the body that is dealing with loss and damage, members that kind of take this approach often talk about that committee playing a catalytic role, right? Getting other organizations, other actors, other governance bodies to do the work on loss and damage. Whereas that other framing, the justice framing, which really, puts responsibility squarely on the shoulders of developed countries that have benefited most from climate change, they tend to focus more on non-economic loss as well as economic loss, right? Pay attention to kind of the full range of kind of human rights implications of loss and damage, rather than thinking more about risk and uncertainty, which doesn't implicate human rights in the same way. And they also have kind of different prescriptions in terms of what global governance institutions should be doing. And so when we think about the kind of three different sets of activities that the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee is responsible for, so enhancing understanding, using its convening power, but also kind of addressing loss and action and driving action and support, there's a lot more emphasis on that third one. And so we've seen, these kind of two different frames clashing in this space and continuing to clash, but they have also evolved. And so, for example, discussions about compensation have shifted a lot over time, and I'm sure we can come to that if we have more time.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's really fantastic. And I think, the word framing is so apt in the sense that, like a frame, it really, the way that you talk about something really moves aspects of an issue in and out of view. So, the human rights and non-economic aspects of loss and damage can really commonly be overlooked as a result of certain framings, like you highlighted. I think that's really interesting. Adele, I know you've been involved, you're a member of the UNFCCC Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management. You've been very involved with the IPCC as a lead author. I'm wondering if you have any comments on what Lisa's just shared, or if you've, on those different framings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framings that Lisa highlighted also show the different perceptions of the timing and the urgency of loss and damage. So that first framing with risk and uncertainty, I think, looks at loss and damage as something out in the future that we need to start, we can deal with it later on. There's not this urgent need to start dealing with loss and damage now because it's something that's going to happen off in the distance. Whereas I think the second framing with justice and responsibility really underscores that loss and damage is happening now. It's affecting, those that are most vulnerable now, and we really need to have urgent response. So I think just adding to that, Lisa, the different, timing issues, I think really helps to clarify the different framings and show why we have, for instance, developing countries and advocates for loss and damage that are so passionate and so, saying we need to deal with this now, versus, some of the people within the negotiating rooms that seem to be very unmoved by this urgency. Thanks.
Thank you, Adele. And really picking up on what you've just said about, the negotiation rooms, or in and out of the negotiation rooms, some of the different approaches, shall we say, to this issue and sort of conflicting views on the issue, I wanted to sort of take the conversation from the more understanding the concept of loss and damage itself and some of the fault lines and those understandings, sort of taking that forward a little bit into where we are now with the negotiations and in the sort of geopolitics of the issue. So at COP26, the climate change negotiations in Glasgow, the first ever dedicated loss and damage finance was committed by the governments of Scotland and the Wallonia region of Belgium, which broke a long-held taboo among the global north around committing financing for loss and damage. However, progress in the negotiations remained limited, and a dedicated loss and damage financing facility proposed by developing countries was rejected. And so I'm going to ask each of you to sort of react and reflect on sort of the events of COP26 in turn. But first to you, Lisa, where do you think the hesitations for global north countries are on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Nina. And I suppose my answer, I kind of have a 5-part answer, though I'll keep it brief. But, you know, some of these are things I've observed in the negotiations and kind of, you know, justifications I've heard in the conversation. Some of them are kind of from conversations otherwise. Some are from the, you know, the kind of wonderful work produced by my peers working in this space. And some are more speculative. So I want to put that out there. And so why are there hesitations for global north countries on this? I think first is the kind of history of the idea of compensation within the UNFCCC. This is a kind of concept that makes the global north countries very, very nervous in terms of thinking about liability and responsibility, right? It was included in the Paris Agreement decision text. There was a kind of explicit exclusion of kind of the Paris Agreement as a basis or, you know, involving compensation or liability. And so that, again, you know, raises really important questions about, well, what is then the best model for funding? Is it about solidarity funds? Is it about reparations, right? And there are kind of a number of different questions that are raised by that. But I think it's really this nervousness, and I've done some research with colleagues, Olivia Sardesny and Elisa Cagliari, where we actually unpack the idea of compensation and how different actors understand it, and where and how it's kind of ebbed and flowed over time. But it tends to be this monolith that really kind of seems to scare the global north. I think the second reason they might have hesitations, or kind of the way they put this forward, is this articulation of, well, you know, we don't know what's causing what here. And, you know, we don't know what impacts are caused by climate change, which ones aren't. You know, there's this whole kind of context of denialism that seems to be ebbing but taking more nefarious forms. And of course, you know, that as the science is improving, that's a less and less viable kind of reason to be hesitant. And, you know, even going back to the history of environmental law, the precautionary principle would say, well, not knowing what's going to happen, or not, you know, not having a sufficient level of evidence isn't a reason for not acting. But that's, you know, another potential explanation. I think a third articulation that I've heard is the growing number of legal cases around climate change. And if in this particular space, global north countries kind of sign up to some understanding of their responsibility in this place for this problem, I think you know, it could cause problems at home. And this is also why I think there's nervousness about introducing human rights language into the UNFCCC space more. And there's a huge kind of number of cases that you know, are already kind of being successful in domestic courts around the world, and international cases that are being tried. And so that's something we're thinking about, and thinking also about kind of different actors coming in. So increasingly we see national human rights institutions starting to think about climate change. And so there's kind of a whole set of other actors starting to influence these debates. I think a fourth one, this is purely speculative, but I think the kind of psychological weight of this topic, of the loss that people are experiencing around the world, and the grief that is going to come as a result of what's happening, is a huge weight to bear. And my feeling is actually there might be some psychological drivers for avoidance of this topic. And I think there's kind of room for interesting psychological research to come in there, as we're increasingly understanding, for example, the weight of climate change among young people. And then I think the fifth reason that we hear articulated all the time in the negotiations that isn't very persuasive, but is this idea of, well, we're going to have our own problems because of climate change in the global north. And so, there's only so much we can do to help the rest of the world because we have to deal with this at home. We have wildfires, we're dealing with sea level rise and coastal communities. So, that's kind of a plethora of different articulations I've heard or that could be put forward for why they are hesitant in this area.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for a really comprehensive overview of that. And I think the last point you raised there about the domestic climate impacts in global north countries is very interesting, because the wildfires in the US and Europe and and the flooding across Europe last year as well has often been credited in the media as a reason for increased attention to loss and damage going into COP26. And so it's very interesting that you suggest it may well have contributed to attention, but it may actually contribute to hesitation to dealing with the issue. So yeah, thank you. Very thought-provoking there. Adele, I'd like to bring you in here. What's your reaction to the developments at COP26, and what do you think is needed to build political will among sort of stakeholders in the global north on this issue of loss and damage?
Yeah, so I was there in Glasgow until the end, and my reaction to the development of the Glasgow dialogues was extreme disappointment. I feel like it's yet another outcome to talk more about an issue, which we have been talking about for decades now. It's yet another dialogue. We've had the SUVA expert dialogue in 2018. We've had the Standing Committee on Finance in 2016. We've had a series of WIM-EXCOM events on risk financing. So we've had these dialogues before, which end up, with an output of a technical paper and recommendations, and then they never go anywhere. And so I feel like this may be yet another stalling tactic to let's continue to delay actual action on loss and damage and continue to talk about it. So I was quite disappointed, and it took me a number of weeks to recover from COP, as it normally does. I think to build political will among global North stakeholders, I think we need more allies in the global North. So it's not just about global South advocates and practitioners, saying that we're experiencing these impacts now. We need more allies in the global North to put political pressure on the people in their countries that come to COP and make these decisions. Like Lisa was saying, there's been more attention on loss and damage. And so at the beginning of COP with the Leaders Summit, we heard lots of talk about loss and damage, but in the negotiating rooms, it was the same blocking and the same, we're going to put this off and we're just going to talk about it. So I think having additional allies, building on some of the civil society organizations in the global North that are already quite active, and on youth organizations, which I'm sure Nasreen will talk about, I think is needed to put political pressure on those in the global North. So it's coming from the inside. And then just finally, I think the climate justice perspective is really important now. It's shifting the whole conversation from asking for help to highlighting responsibilities. And I think, we've seen in other movements where you have, oppressed or disadvantaged people, the conversation changes as you experience more hardship. And I think we're seeing that change now. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adele. That's really a really important reflection, and I think actually leads very well into Nasreen. As the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, how are global youth coalitions responding to these developments at COP26?
Well, no matter how young I looked, COP26 was my 7th COP actually. So I attended 7th COP, and I was so surprised that Adele still get disappointed from the outcomes of the COP. I mean, unfortunately, you get used to that after a while. At least I did. And I never did negotiation of loss and damage or finance or adaptation for my mental health. So for mental health reasons, I always do gender or technology transfer because or capacity building. There is an actual progress in these agenda items comparing to markets or loss and damage or finance or adaptation. But I guess also there is a big gap between the young activists in the global north, because I just mentioned it, and the experts of the global north. For example, the first time I heard about loss and damage, I think it was right after Paris, because they separated loss and damage from adaptation. And I was talking deeply with Dr. Sumaya Zakidin, who's the African group of negotiators lead coordinator for loss and damage. And there is a great bonding between most of the African negotiators with the African youth movement, comparing to what's happening in the global north. And also, I think this gap is creating lack of content when it comes to the global north young advocacy for certain issues, for example, the loss and damage, comparing to the ones coming from the global south. I was laughing the whole time Lisa was talking, because I am so happy that you didn't bring me back to the panel after her, because she said it all. So developed countries, or they like to call themselves the Annex 1 or non-Annex 1 countries. First of all, that they claim that the crisis that we are having is not caused by climate change. So we don't know if it's really something related to climate change. And then at the end, they come and say, well, we will also suffer from climate change, so we cannot really fund things. So they start by denying the problem, and then they end by actually proving the problem, that it will happen to themselves. And so they can't really show support to other countries, which for me, it's a funny fact. Talking about the youth movement and how much they can bring to the table right now is a bit tricky, because also reading through the history of loss and damage, we all know the gentleman agreement that happened during Paris of no compensations. We also know that the basic pillars of the convention, when it was signed back ago in the 90s, was actually common but shared responsibility, and the historical responsibility of the developed countries and the industrial countries. So renegotiating the convention itself every time in the negotiation room is really something, for me, it's a wasting of time, but of course it's a very known negotiating techniques. We as young people, we are not only part of the demonstrations outside, we're not only part of the movement in our local communities, but we are also part of the negotiation rooms. There's a lot of negotiating group who are actually including young people within the delegates with them. Unfortunately, all of this is not enough, because loss and damage have a very high price tag, even higher than the adaptation price tag. The losses of any of the floods in any of the developing country is very huge, and it needs an immediate response, and it has to be direct responsibility of the developed countries or the emitter countries. It's also very weird for me that developed countries keep admitting that they will suffer themselves from climate change one day, and they are suffering. As you mentioned, wildfires, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on. Yet they keep emitting and keep raising their emissions level, and we are still very far from track. So there is no balance in the two claims, and I think this is what we need to work most on them. If you really realize that climate change will hit you as equal as it's hitting other countries right now, you need to stop and actually cut your emissions. Otherwise, we can talk about adaptation very soon. It will be very soon where adaptation will be off table, because no country can adapt to the changes and to the devastating impacts of climate change.
Thank you, Nazreen. That's a really helpful kind of overview. And I'm wondering, how do you see going forward from those developments at COP26? What could the Glasgow Dialogue achieve to advance loss and damage? If you could just sort of briefly give us maybe a couple of key points you think where there could be areas for progress.
Well, I guess first of all, definitions. What is loss and damage, and how to be compensated, and maybe starting the mechanism for the compensation. And the problem is we cannot really say compensation inside of the negotiation room, otherwise it will be red flag from everyone. So whenever we say compensation, we have to say, as mentioned before in the panel, solidarity, support, humanitarian aid, whatever. And the third thing is to actually strengthen the mechanism that is already there. The Warsaw mechanism is there. It's just without hands or feet. So we need to strengthen that. And this what easily could be actually achieved in Glasgow.
Thank you. That's very clear and concrete action points. And I'm wondering, Lisa, Adele, could you come in with maybe a reaction or any other things that you think would be sort of important key steps at the Glasgow dialogue?
I can maybe come in, and I like kind of Nisreen's ambition there, and I think I think that's what this takes. I think whether we're going to see that is really difficult. As Adele pointed out, there's been a lot of dialogue of different forms, right? A lot of papers, a lot of discussion, and I think that needs to shift. And I think kind of the Glasgow, where we got to in Glasgow, and then Adele's disappointment, and I think there's disappointment across all of us that follow loss and damage. It did feel like this is maybe an opportunity, and I commend kind of the Stockholm Environment Institute has produced a paper on a kind of fair and feasible finance mechanism for loss and damage. And I think, their proposals and their research really offers a kind of important starting point for thinking about what's doable within this space and then building from that. So that seems to me like a good place to start, I suppose.
Yeah, and from my end, I would say really to move beyond those dialogues that have been held in the past, not reiterating the same things that we've been saying over the past 30 years. So moving from talking about how important loss and damage is, moving from trying to convince that it's actually happening. We have scientific evidence from that now with the IPCC coming out, and into looking at solutions. So I think that the dialogue should hopefully conclude with an actual financing facility and not conclude with another technical paper to join the other technical papers that are already out there. So I think really having this dialogue to spur action is what is needed.
If I may jump here also, it's very important to mention that next year, COP27 will be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which will be, it's already defined as an African COP. And I can tell you that top priorities for Africa right now are three things: adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. So I think we will have even more pressure from different stakeholders next COP. But unfortunately, and I hope also we don't have big disappointments next year. And I also hope that by that time, the political will might shift a little bit towards the justice concept and the equity concept, not the equality concept. We've seen a lot of floods in US, for example, a lot of hurricanes, but the adaptation processes to that, the recovery processes for that in US and the capabilities of the country, for example, is by far different than when it happens in South Sudan, for example, or in Somalia or in Bangladesh. So we have a big challenge next year, as this will be the highlight of the conference, to actually make it or break it.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing in that angle about, the importance of the priorities of African countries for this upcoming COP. We've got plenty of questions coming in, and so I'll kick it off with a couple of questions. There are two questions that are quite similar, and so we'd like the two audience members to, who are asking them, to each unmute one by one, and then our speakers will be able to answer them together. So these are actually both directed to Adele. Firstly from Lissolette Jensen, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Hi, yeah, my question was, I understood your initial intervention, Adele, as pointing to this issue of understanding what does it mean, loss and damage, like what does it cover, what are we actually talking about? So my question was, what steps are being taken to reach a consensus, like a clear classification, but also limitation maybe for what loss and damage might be, which could bring these global North allies when also thinking of all the apprehension that Lisa was mentioning for why they're not exactly jumping jumping at the issue. So yeah, those were my questions, and of course leading into COP27. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And before I pass it over to Adele to answer, if Nicholas Pandey could also ask his question, please. It was related.
Yes, thank you very much, Nina. I trust that you hear me. I really appreciate your thoughts and especially that understanding from Adele. My question was just on how really to deal with the entire understanding of loss and damage. That one, if you understand it to start where adaptation limits are reached, then will we ever have loss and damage realized anytime soon? Because we're already talking about very low adaptation or resilience of communities, and even the adaptation fund itself is still very low. So it means you raise that adaptation happens, and then when you exit that, that's when the loss and damage starts. So will we ever get there then? But secondly is that in that first understanding that negative impacts of climate change then would constitute loss and damage. Just looking at that and looking at then how we do adaptation and maybe funding designated for adaptation, how different would you think if we had the loss and damage fund and adaptation fund, and we have that understanding of loss and damage upheld, how would the two differ? Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you for these great questions. And Adele, I'll pass them over to you.
Yeah, thanks for these very insightful questions. I think for the first one, what steps are being taken to reach a consensus? I think what's important to note is that there is overlap between those different understandings. And so I think naturally through these additional dialogues and through, moving from dialogue into action, there may be more coalescing around what we understand loss and damage to be. And I think, really the first understanding of all negative impacts, and then the third understanding of existential and irreversible impacts, it's still impacts of climate change. It depends on the scope and the scale, but it's still impacts of climate change, negative impacts of climate change. So, I mean, even through time, we've seen coalescing of these different categorizations. So I think with additional time, unfortunately, we may see unfortunately that we need so much time to come to a consensus, but I think that that's what may help with that. I think the scientific research is also helping with that. So with IPCC, our next Working Group 2 report, which comes out in March, has some information on, we call it losses and damages. And I think that scientific literature really helps to advance the understanding. For the other question on talking about, the difference between loss and damage occurring after adaptation limits arise is a great question. And this is, I think it's advantageous for some to say loss and damage doesn't occur until after adaptation limits, because then it makes it harder to say what is loss and damage. And then it puts the focus on adaptation. So we only need to have funding for adaptation and not for loss and damage. And so I don't really agree with that second conceptualization, because it is so difficult to then quantify or to qualify what is loss and damage if you have to reach an adaptation limit, but there is no funding for adaptation in the first place. And then I think for the first understanding on where would the difference be between loss and damage funding and adaptation funding, I think the loss and damage funding would come in when you actually experience the impacts. So you need to respond to a flood, and you need to respond to slow onset events like sea level rise and coastal erosion. I think the money may come in ex post, which is what it's called. But even within the UNFCCC, the whole terminology of averting, minimizing, and addressing really covers mitigation, adaptation, and then dealing with when you actually have the impacts. So it is a very convoluted space. I think perhaps we're shifting more to thinking of all negative impacts as a result of climate change can be called loss and damage, and then figuring out how do we deal with that holistically. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adele, for those really comprehensive answers to some quite tricky questions. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Shifting over to sort of a discussion about the next steps in terms of climate change negotiations and operationalizing the Santiago Network. Colin McQuiston, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hello, thanks everybody for an excellent session today. So one of the things that was agreed in Glasgow was to operationalize the Santiago Network for loss and damage. So do the panelists think that the operationalization of the Santiago Network is a way to make progress on delivering the much needed action and support to address loss and damage? And if so, in what ways? Or is this just another red herring to delay progress? Thanks.
So I'll open that up to anyone who'd like to answer it. Perhaps Lisa or Nisreen, if you have any thoughts on that.
Maybe I can come in first, and yeah, thanks so much, Colin. It's a really good point. You know, the Santiago Network was agreed in 2019 in the before times, right, of COVID, and it felt like it's pretty slow moving, like most things in this space. So most of the negotiations I observed in Glasgow around the Santiago Network were focusing on the nitty gritty of the functions of the Santiago Network. What was it going to do? And the Santiago Network, for those who are less familiar, is kind of a new technical arm under the Warsaw International Mechanism to provide support to developing countries with loss and damage. Very much in the early days, you know, in some ways the proposal was modeled on the kind of capacity building and tech kind of facility in a similar form, and having a more political arm and a more technical arm. I mean, Colin, I think the jury is still out on that one. And I suppose I'm reminded whenever I do this work on loss and damage that the best way to get, you know, to make sure that something isn't done is to set up another committee or another body. Having said that, you know, there is, you know, there is a lot of need for this kind of technical support and assistance. Again, the science is growing about what countries need. There is some epistemological injustice in that developing countries probably have a less well-developed understanding, or there's less of a science of loss in that particular space, and the kind of research has suggested that. So we know that we need to better understand the problems there and kind of potential solutions in those particular spaces. So I continue to remain hopeful that this is a kind of body that has some potential to it, particularly if some of the politics could be removed from it. But whether that's going to be viable, I think Egypt will tell us a lot.
Fantastic, thank you. And Nisreen, would you want to jump in on that as well?
Yes, actually, my only problem is how much we actually achieved with the Warsaw mechanism. So now we can talk about Santiago Network. Sometimes creating new bodies and new committees is not necessarily supporting the case as much as weakening or diluting the case itself. Yet it's a great opportunity to raise the ambition, whatever raise ambition means, actually. Yet, as mentioned by all of the panelists, in the sphere of the lack of political will, it's very hard to have anything moving regarding the negotiation. All of the negotiators, or most of the negotiators, are employees by the government, and this is a fact we cannot ignore. And if they went against the government's policies, then they will lose their jobs, and they will get someone that actually can implement the policies of the government. So if the change, unfortunately, didn't come from up, it will not come from the and up, I mean the higher level of policy making or decision making in the country. It will be very much challenging and even almost impossible to have it different in the room, in the negotiations.
Oh, go on, Adele, please.
I just wanted to say, I think developing countries fought hard for the Santiago Network. So I think it does have some potential to move things forward in terms of action and support on the ground. What I'm a bit hesitant about is that funding for loss and damage it doesn't only become funding for the Santiago Network, right? So we only allocate funding for these technical assessments to be done. There's only funding for risk assessments and plans, but then no funding actually allocated to deal with loss and damage or to address those loss and damage that's being experienced on the ground. And so that's my fear with the Santiago Network on loss and damage, is that we'll say, we're already providing funding for the network, we don't need to provide any additional funding. And it could end up, like the NDCs and the NAPs, where you have money to produce an NDC or money to produce a NAP, but then where's the money for implementation? And that's my hesitancy with the SNLT. Thanks.
Thank you. That's such a key point, and especially when it comes to the issue of providing finance at all, it's important that that finance reaches the people who need it and is sort of prioritized in the proper way. So I think that's a really important point as well. Now, a question about the role of Global North NGOs, which is really picking up on something, Nazreen, you said earlier during our discussion. So I'll invite Lubna Hawa to unmute themselves and ask their question, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I wanted to bring up the perspective of how the Northern NGOs are reacting or responding to the dialogue on loss and damage. Do you see the same level of hesitance? And also your input on how we could work better at advancing or pressuring the governments to commit to loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'll pass it over to Nazreen.
Thank you for asking this question. It's very important, yet it's very wide question. So there is a lot of things you can actually do, starting from having an open dialogue with the scientists and the people who actually have the informations and the modeling. It might be big and sophisticated and a bit complicated information to be digested, but then it's our job to actually make it easier to understand for the public and for the young people and for the population of the country to understand that what's happening right now is not natural disasters, it's climate crises, and it causes loss and damage. This is very simple, and we can actually do it better than we are doing it right now. I'm talking especially about the Global North. The second thing is the advocacy campaigns that can happen. So we had a big advocacy campaign around loss and damage last COP, for example, but the advocacy campaign was loss and damage matters. No one said why it matters. No one said how much impactful it is on the lives. And also showing solidarity is a bit misleading. It's important, of course, to show solidarity, but it's a bit misleading because we are talking about historical responsibility. It is the responsibility of the developed countries on which is we're actually living right now. So stressing that it's not only solidarity, but it's duty, because developed countries did it, and now we are actually living the sequences of that. And I think that the young people, the young generation of the Global North understand it better because they also feel that it's injustice from the previous generations, because it's a problem that the previous generations caused, and now our generation is dealing with that. So sending the right messages, having more scientific content in the messages, having like checkpoints. So for example, now everyone knows that we did not achieve what we want in loss and damage. Go in the street, ask any of the climate activists why we didn't actually reach, what happened that makes us say that we didn't reach. You will not find an answer. So having articulated checkpoints to say, well, we wanted to have a funding mechanism. We wanted to have like more better structured for the different mechanisms that we have right now. We wanted a clear definition and a clear admission of responsibilities. So we didn't get this, we didn't get that, so we call it a failure. But if you don't have these targets and these very clear points, it will be very hard to say whether we are actually going in the right direction or not. So there is more of responsibility sense in the advocacy campaign that we had last year. It will be very much preferable.
Thank you very much for providing that perspective, Nazreen. And I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and while there are so many great questions, I think it might be time for us to wrap up. So I thought I'd just give you each a minute to just make some brief closing remarks and share any reflections you have on the discussion or anything that you feel is important and hasn't been mentioned yet. And if you don't mind, I'll start with you, Lisa, and then we'll turn to Adele and Nazreen.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be a part of this, and I've learned so much from my fellow panelists as well. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I suppose the one thing to bear in mind for audience members is that this isn't, loss and damage is not just an issue for COP. This is a a year-round thing that is live. The Warsaw International Mechanism XCOM is having their meetings several times a year. There are SBs. There are lots of kind of different opportunities and vantage points for NGOs to get involved with the particular different issues related to loss and damage. So there's the Task Force on Displacement, there's the Comprehensive Risk Management Group, a new one on kind of action and support and slow onset events and non-economic losses. So there are kind of lots of different angles within which to kind of enter those discussions and provide expertise, and so I would just encourage kind of audience members to continue watching this topic, which I think is so important.
Thank you. And Adele?
Yeah, I think for my closing remarks, I think we complicate loss and damage so much, and it becomes like this nebulous concept that only people who've been in the space for so long can understand. And I think that discourages people from engaging, but I think that engagement of people is so important because we've seen, the advocacy work, the civil society, people protesting is really what has pushed loss and damage forward and really, what made loss and damage such a big issue at this last COP. And so I think, understanding that loss and damage is about negative impacts of climate change that people are experiencing now that will continue to get worse and that are affecting the most disadvantaged already in society. That's what loss and damage is. That's why it's such a big deal. That's why we should all be involved. And so I think, understanding at the base what loss and damage is and seeing how you can be involved to make a change, I think is what I wanted to highlight. Thanks.
Thank you, Adele, for that great call to action. That's really important. And Nazreen, if you have any reflections you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think being sensitive to the different contexts is very important. I see a lot of people, for example, advocating for no flights, for example, but a lot of people doesn't have any kind of infrastructure that allows them to not take a flight to go from point A to point B, for example. So whenever you talk about how much climate change is impacting you, please remember the other contexts of the world around you and how vulnerable other people in other countries are comparing to your case. Then you will get the bigger picture that climate change is really, really hitting very hard a lot of people around you, and you're a lot of privilege comparing to them. So for us, it's not discussions of webinars or Zooms or COPs only. It's a matter of life and death, actually, for a lot of people. Sorry for taking longer, but I just want to share that we did a study once in Sudan, and 80% of the Sudanese young people who participated in the study, and I'm saying that because Lisa mentioned the psychological impact of that. 80% of Sudanese people young people who participated in the survey said they would migrate illegally to Europe, even if they know that there is 95% chance of them dying in the Mediterranean. And for me, this is a mass suicidal behavior from the young people. But they said we are dead anyway, so it's better us to die and trying doing something than dying waiting the climate change to solve us. So it's the reality that we all live, and I'm sure that other young people around the world have the same feeling, especially when they are hit so much, so long, so hard by climate crises, and changes are not really happening yet.
Thank you for sharing that, Nazreen. That's a truly shocking statistic. And I think, as you and Lisa have both drawn attention to the sort of emotional and psychological side of this issue, and which is often overlooked in these, very technical bureaucratic discussions, and is of course incredibly important, as well as the fact that, the burden of these impacts are very unequally felt. And so I just want to thank you. You've been a fantastic panel. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise on this truly important, urgent, and complex issue. It's been really interesting to see. I think Adele really highlighted this, that there's loss and damage in terms of global governance, and there's loss and damage in terms of lived experience of direct impacts. And in the way that they're discussed, there's a significant gap, and there's a gap in the perception of how urgent these issues are. And that's related to all kinds of things that we've talked about in this panel, you know, power dynamics, vulnerability and exposure to impacts as well. And, you know, you three are all absolutely, you know, leading the way in terms of closing that gap in understanding and in terms of navigating these different framings of loss and damage as well. So thank you for what you're doing. And I'm sure if the audience is interested, they can follow up with some of the resources of yours that we've shared in the chat box as well. I also want to thank the audience for your total engagement and all of your fantastic questions. And I just wanted to flag that we've gathered your questions and we're going to actually feed these into our next event, as this is the first of a series of 2 events on loss and damage that we're hosting. The second event is in 3 weeks' time on the 8th of February. And it's focused on solutions and possible ways forward. We want it to be a really concrete and constructive conversation. And so we'll feed in those specific questions you have to make sure that they are answered, and keep an eye out for registrations. They'll be opening in the next few days. So thank you to the audience and thank you to the fantastic panelists. We really appreciate your time. So thank you for being with us today.